Chapter 19, Transforming the West, 1865 to 1890. Now, if you followed my directions, you have already watched the two videos of John Green Crash Course and the Wounded Knee one, and you've also read your chapter. I sincerely hope that you get very angry when you read that section, especially the first part of it about the Indians and the bad treatment. And we were engaged in no way you could say it any other way, ethocide. We were trying to destroy a race that we thought weren't even human. They were treated even worse than our black slaves were in the South. And when you read the description, like I say, I couldn't do justice to it. I had Indian blood, and I was married to an Indian, and I just get sick at my stomach when I read about stuff like that. I mean, we treated them so horribly. We could not recognize them as human beings, and they had culture, they had civilization, they had laws, they had beautiful art, but we considered them pagan. They weren't Christians, and they had something we wanted. We wanted the land, and we disregarded the treaties and everything else. So I want you to read from the beginning of the chapter. I guess it's just a couple of pages. My text is 524 through 531, 6 or 7 pages, but it's just loaded with information. And of course, the video, the Wounded Knee video, kind of says it all. So for my peace of mind and for yours, we're going to start with mining on page 531. Gold rush. Of course, we had this first gold rush before we ever had the Civil War, and it's part of the reason because California became a state, because she went from the sleepy little western territory to overnight we had tent cities of thousands of people. But the gold rush in 1859 was in Colorado, and at the same time we had a silver rush in Nevada. And it's going to lead to some problems later on about whether we're going to be on the gold standard or the silver standard, which I think we'll get into that next chapter. There's also a gold rush in the 1860s in the Dakotas, and a little bit later we had another gold rush in Alaska. But these mining camps, like I said, they'd spring up out of nothing. And they were always isolated. And the shanties, oh, I mean, it's like a lean-to type thing if they were lucky. The towns and streets would be full of mud. They wouldn't have any sidewalks. They'd be full of saloons and dance halls and brothels. Now, the statement is made that they're overwhelmingly male populated. Yes, and of course, in the brothels, you didn't have the males, you had the females. But because of few economic opportunities for women, very few women went to the mining camps. If you were a wife or a girl who did not want to go into the dance halls or become a prostitute, you could earn a very good living doing laundry and baking for the miners. But the saloons actually were social centers, because I mean, what else did you have to do? But because of the drinking and the gambling, the violence, the violence was just unheard of. At the drop of a hat, you could have a fight because somebody weighed the gold wrong and they were paying in gold. We didn't have species at the time. They used their gold dust and gold nuggets to pay for their stuff. And between the miners, there was a lot of competition over claims. And of course, any foreigner was not welcomed. And the text mentions that Rock Springs, Wyoming, where the Chinese were frowned upon because, oh my goodness, they're not like us. I mean, the men wear pigtails and dresses, and they've never bothered a soul, and they've been brought over, a lot of them had been brought over involuntarily to work on the railroads. But the Chinese, in 1885, 28 were killed, and over 700 were forced to leave their little Chinatown. The single owner mine or claim didn't last long. So it didn't take long for them to strip all the service deposits. And pretty soon you're going to have these big corporations and big operations come in, because it takes capital, a lot of capital. And once you've got corporations come in, you get corporate control. And you no longer are mining your own claim, so to speak. You're working for a large corporation. And you're going below ground. It's going to be hot and hard and dangerous work. And if you can't get your owner to do something about the safety or the condition, you're going to form unions. Well, we didn't even have mine inspectors until the 1880s, and I know in Kentucky it was even later than that, but they had inspectors, but they were on the payroll of somebody else, and they never did anything. That was bad. But the miners would form unions and they'd go on strike, not so much for higher wages, but for safety conditions. And there'd be violence. And of course, the management didn't like strikes. No management likes strikes. They'd hire private armies to break heads or legs, kill people. And if you were on the list of someone who tried to start a union or you tried to participate in a strike, you would be blacklisted. And this is a word we're going to hear again in the 20th century. The mine owners would get together and they'd actually have a list of people that you weren't supposed to hire. But the miners, I mean, they raped the land. It wasn't until the 1990s that we ever got any reclamation laws passed. They'd come in, it's like the strip mining there in Kentucky. They'd go in and take the metal and destroy the land and leave. And this is what's happening with the resources that they want. There's so much a high demand for the resources other than gold and silver, and gold and silver is in big demand. And here we go, tear up the land. But we didn't just have the miners, we had the cowboys transforming the West. And we have what we call cow towns, which are a result of the railroad building. And of course, the government had given land to companies and people to build railroads. And then we started having, once we had these hubs where we had the railroads coming through, they'd drive cattle up from Texas and then go to a little town like Abilene, Kansas, or Wichita, Kansas. And they cut something called the Chisholm Trail through Indian Territory in Oklahoma and all to get to the railhead. But these cow towns was where the railroad hub was, and there again, they were violent. These people live hard and play hard. I mean, you got the same thing. You got prostitution and gambling, and oh my gosh, it's very, very expensive. Now, some of these little cow towns, they grew into cities like Wichita. Abilene became a small farm town, and I can attest to that because I lived in Abilene, Kansas for 8 years before I came back to Kentucky. And they have so many restrictions they don't want to grow. They're terribly afraid that somebody on Interstate 70 is going to drop off the interstate and do something to their town. Walmart even tried to buy land to make a store there, and they wouldn't even let them do that. There's two stoplights. I remember that. Population 15,400. And I don't think at the time, I was back there a couple of years ago, I don't think anybody lived in town, if they didn't have to, that was under the age of 60. It's an old person's town, because as soon as the kids graduate from high school, they go to Topeka or Wichita or someplace. But Abilene didn't grow. But it's also, just for your FYI, it also is the hometown of Dwight David Eisenhower. But cowboys, as you saw from the YouTube video, Westerns have been romanticized so much because of the dime novel and the movies and the TV series. Think about Matt Dillon and Gunsmoke. My goodness. But the cattle ranches, well, they had to have a lot of land to farm these cattle or to graze these cattle. And foreign investors soon realized that, they could sit in England or Germany or France and have money or go into a partnership with somebody here and just sit over there and not worry about it. And the cowboy here in the States has to worry about taking care of the cattle. But they were big money to be made because the eastern cities, they're begging for beef. But the more the cattle ranchers grew, they began to restrict the access to the range to anyone they considered a competitor. And because of lack of timber, they started using barbed wire for fencing. And pretty soon you've got violence between ranchers or sodbusters or squatters, and that's supposed to be farmers, not frames. Farmers and any competitor that had a ranch, even you just guarded what you had with as much force as you could. But because of the overstocking, and we have the same thing happen in any field of endeavor. There's a big demand for refrigerators. Man, you're going to build refrigerators till you're coming out your ears, and pretty soon you've got an overabundance. Well, before you know it, we have an overabundance. And there's so many cattle on the range that they're eating all the grass up, and droughts cause grass not to grow, and grass doesn't grow, the cattle die. So the farmers and ranchers had to come up with an idea of some kind of new grass to grow because the natural grass was just not going to grow. But no matter how much cows you had, they still had to depend upon the cowhands to take care of the cattle and investors. And who did they work as cowhands? Well, predominantly Mexicans and blacks. And by the way, that's where the expression cowboy comes from, because there were so many blacks, and this was a derogatory term used by the whites, boy, and it was a black boy. He was a cowboy. and gradually got bastardized and is used for the whole type of people who work with cows and the Hispanics. And of course, they had their own type of clothing. They wore boots, chaps, and they always carried their ropes. And my husband, as I said, who was an Indian, he worked on a ranch in Kansas, as a matter of fact, before he got into other things. When he got married, he came in with his chaps and his, oh, what do you call those things on the back? His furs. Uh, I just can't even imagine living like that. But anyway, but as the corporations took over the ranching, like they did the mining, the Cowboys' rights, what few they had, were gone. So of course, what do? You see your rights eroding and nobody's helping you. You form a union, and if you still can't get help, you go on strike. And guess what? Anytime you have a strike during this time period, there's always violence. And they passed something called the Homestead Act in 1862, where you could get 160 acres free from the government. The only thing is you got to mark your plot, because they've generally gone out and marked these in big 160-acre lots or plots with numbers and things, and then they have these big rushes where you get into wagons and horses and you drive like crazy to claim this plot. You had to farm it for 5 years, and over 375,000 of them were actually claimed. The problem being, and your text points that out very well, that the best land had already been gone because the government either given it away or sold it, and they gave so much land to the railroads and other companies to get them to move west and to grow. And they did that before they even passed that act. But of course, the newspapers and businessmen are hyping the opportunity to go and gain land. And the idea of owning your own land, 160 acres, I was thrilled to death just to get 1 acre paid off there in Philpott. I can't imagine owning 160 acres. So migration was definitely encouraged. The main thing that the Northeast wanted was one of these people to go out there and farm so they can send products back to the East, because your cities are so big, they're not growing anything. You're importing everything, and they need food. And most settlers landed in what we call the Great Plains, which is the area from North Dakota all the way down to Texas. Hot, flat, dry, believe me. Living in Kansas for that many years, I attest to that. It was white predominantly, but there were some blacks. Because if you notice, the Homestead Act was passed in 1862, which is during the Civil War. So we had some slaves who ran away, would migrate and try to get it, and once they get out of the slave area, they're free. But they even settled in little communities, but they didn't always work out. And even some people came all the way over from Europe. Now, these foreign-born and the blacks, well, you have a tendency to settle near those who are like you. So if you're from Germany, you got a group coming over from Germany, you'll have a little settlement of Germans or a little settlement of Irishmen or a settlement of blacks. The same ethnic background. It makes you feel a little bit more comfortable, and then you can keep up your own traditions. So instead of assimilating, you're having your own way. But there's a very famous historian, Frederick Jackson Turner. And people came to this country originally to, well, like back east, New England. They were going to have a New England here. The Puritans came over to have a new church. And people, when they went west, they tried to take what they knew with them, build the houses and things like they had back in Ohio or Indiana or wherever. But it's not going to work, because as much as you try to change the land, according to Mr. Turner, the land is going to change you. You have to adapt. So these people going out on the plains to live is going to be totally different from what they had back east. Number one, the way they live, that's sod houses. But there's so many Hispanics and Indians and Chinese and people already here. And when you have a massive amount of white Anglos arriving and intermingling with the Hispanics, you're going to destroy their traditions, their societies. And then you start turning around, and Texas is a state now, of course, and it's just loaded with Mexicans. But all these land grants they had gotten from their government were not being recognized, or the titles would be ignored, or they'd be overturned by the government. And there was some violence, and some of the Hispanic got together, and there was a little violence. They started cutting all their Anglo fences, but it didn't do anything to get them into trouble, and it was very unsuccessful, because there was more white men than there were Hispanics. But as their loss of land grew, of course, they had to turn to other ventures to go back to Mexico. So they started working as laborers, and they're called stoop laborers, because they're bent over picking lettuce and vegetables and things like that. or they'd work on the railroads, or they'd work on the mines, or anywhere they could find a job. But life on the range, like I mentioned earlier, they're short of trees. It is flat and not many trees out there at all. So there's no lumber. So you have to build a shelter out of sod. And it's a kind of a, they call it prairie marble, I think is what it's called. And inside is dark and it's dirty. And, you have bugs and things crawling out of the walls. It's just better than being out in the open, I guess. And they build them like a foot thick. Sometimes they were just simple one-room little cabins, and sometimes they got pretty fancy. But women's work, and like Mr. Green said on his YouTube, women, oh boy, they worked in the home. They got up, they got the breakfast started, and they slopped the hogs, and they fed the chickens and brought in the eggs, and they did the laundry, and they birthed the babies, and they cooked and they cleaned, they manufactured clothes. They had to educate their children, birth the babies. They were husband's companion. And of course, there's little contact with anyone outside the family because you live miles away. So you're isolated and you're lonely and bored. Well, I don't know how you can be bored when you got that much to do, but doing the same thing all the time with no break, you will get bored. Even if it's going to school all the time. But women begin later on toward the end of the century to have a little more contact because their husbands are the ones that's going to town. They're not going to get to go to town. They begin to get together and they start organizing social activities. They'd organize a fair or a dance or a picnic, and they'd establish churches and schools. And the biggest society meeting place was the churches, and most of them were non-denominational at this point in time. So you would meet there on Sunday, and Sunday would be a big day if you could get a minister to come in and preach. It'd be an all-day type thing, because after you had your service, you might have a picnic or some kind of meeting. Or another thing that was a lot of fun was during election time, the men would come around and have these long speeches and then offer you a picnic or a beer or something. But rural families, they started getting together because they had to depend on each other, and they created what they call cooperatives. And that way they would get together, and it's somebody and you can all store your grain in one place. And all of a sudden we're getting mail deliveries a little bit better, so we start making use of those mail order companies like Sears and Montgomery Wards. But farming on the plain is not easy. As I said, lack of lumber or trees, you got no timber, so you have to use barbed wire fences. And of course, on the plains, you don't have that much rain. You're going to have to irrigate or dry farm, which means finding some kind of crop to grow that doesn't require a lot of water. And then you got to build a windmill. You got to dig a well first so you can find water, and then you're going to use the windmill and the wind to pump the water up for you. And these cooperatives build grain elevators. And by the late of the 19th century to the 1890s, technology is just going gangbusters. We've got tractors and all kinds of new things to do. And because of the new productivity, your production increases. You've got railroads to help you get this produce to eastern markets. You've got overseas markets. And banks are extending credit and encouraging you to buy land, and on and on and on. I usually use the example of my father-in-law. Now, he was from Texas. And coming through Oklahoma, he went through one of the Indian reservations, and he saw this pretty little Indian maiden, and he married her and took her in on Kansas, and she was 100% Creek Indian. So my husband's not 100% Indian; he's only half. I don't know where I got sidetracked. I have no idea where I was going with that. But banks are extending credit and encourage. Oh, I know. I was going to tell you about my sister-in-law. He bought a farm, 40 acres, for $15,000 back in the 1930s. And he farmed it. And he paid for it in full by the time World War II started, real good. And made money every year. He was a truck farm. He grew nothing but watermelons and cantaloupes. Of course, Grandma had her own garden out back. She had her own fruit trees she had managed to bring up from Oklahoma. Everything they needed, they grew except for beans and coffee and sugar. She got tired of making her own flour, so she finally started buying flour. But that was the only commodity she'd buy, and she'd buy those ones every 6 months or a year. But next door, my sister-in-law, her youngest daughter, they had a 300-acre dairy farm. And they had these tractors with the balsam seats and the air conditioned and the piped-in music, and it took a 40-acre field to turn the darn thing around in. And every year they lost money, because every year they'd buy new fancy equipment. Whereas my father-in-law, he drove an old Ford tractor, didn't even have an umbrella on it. It was the kind you got out in the front and you cranked. He didn't even have the electric starter on it. And the kids got up every morning, and my husband remembers this well, going out there and hoeing, getting the weeds out of the watermelon patch. Uh, so this is the problem. Banks are extending credit like crazy during good times because the farms are making money. When you've got good times and you've got high prices on your crops and you've got good weather, you make good money. But oops, bad times are coming. Late 1880s, we got drought. It happens to hit at the same time there's a slump in the crop prices. The European markets start to contract, and some countries even erect trade barriers and won't trade with us. And then we find that everybody had been so eager to buy our grains and things, and all of a sudden we're competing with Argentina and Canada and Australia and Russia. Oh dear. And that high cost of getting anything to market, the railroad prices are just really high. And of course, it's not my fault. I want to sell stuff, I want to grow stuff, but how did I get in the mess I'm in? Okay, it's the railroad's fault. I know it's those Eastern corporations and the banks who'd lend us the money, and now they won't back off. They want their money back now, and they can't understand I don't have it because I can't grow crops because I've got no rain. And before you know it, in the 1890s, we're starting to see farms foreclosed on. And I was not mentioning in your text, just 3 short years later, while things are going bad on the farms, in 1892, we have a stock market crash and a massive depression that's going to last for about 4 years, which we get into in the next chapter. But things are going so good, but this is what we have even in the industrial end of it. You've got booms and busts. Things are going really good and everybody's making money, or things are going really bad and you have to blame somebody, and it's always the Eastern bankers that get the blame. Now, chapter 20 is called Politics and Government. And I know most people don't really like the idea, but it's only 21 pages long, and there's lots of pictures, and I can find you some cute videos to watch. It should go relatively fast. So when you're comfortable with the information from the first 3 lessons, take your quiz. Well, the quiz is only going to be on this chapter. But after you do the quiz and the essay from chapter 19, take a breath, get you a Pepsi or a cup of coffee or whatever your drink of choice is, and relax a few minutes, then take your test. Now remember, these are timed. Your quiz is 30 minutes, your essay's an hour, and they've got to be in on Monday the 8th. Your test, you've got 2 hours, and it doesn't have to be in until Monday the 9th. So everything is due Sunday except a test. Tests are always due on Monday to give you a little bit of a break between the two. So good luck, dears.